Promises, promises, promises. Have you ever found yourself in such a cynical place that you just weren't sure you could really believe or buy into any more promises that were made? See if you recognize some of these promises. Here's the first one. We'll leave the light on for you. Remember that promise? Who made that promise? Tom Bodett of Motel 6. He made that promise. I think I've stayed at a Motel 6 once in my life, and I don't remember if they left the lights on or not. I think we got there during the daylight hours, so I have no idea if they keep that promise or not, but that's the promise that they make. Here's another one. You're going to love the way you look. Anybody remember that promise? Anybody remember who made that promise? That was, I don't know his name, but it was the guy from Men's Warehouse. Remember that? You're going to love the way you look if you buy a suit from Men's Warehouse. Actually, I bought a suit from Men's Warehouse last year. I never love the way I look, so I'm not sure. But how about this one? This one's a little bit older, so some of you young people might not have this one, but Have It Your Way. Remember that one? It was part of a theme. It was part of a song. It was like, hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders don't upset us. All we ask is that you let us make it your way. Have it your way at Burger King. That's right. I don't think I've ever made a special order at Burger King, so I can't confirm whether or not they keep that promise or not, but that's the promise, is that we can have it our own way. You'll know this one. Plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is. You know, of course, that is Alka-Seltzer. You might find relief if you drink this stuff, but you have to drink it first, and I always found that to be kind of a difficult proposition. I just pop a couple of minty flavored Tums in, and that does the trick for me. You can cut an aluminum can in half and still slice a tomato into paper thin slices. Remember that one? Ginzu, the Ginzu knife company makes that promise. Promises, promises, promises. Can you believe every promise? Or are there times when it is fair to doubt? Turn, if you would, to Exodus chapter 6 as we wrap up our first series in Exodus that we've been calling The Leader. And we'll see once again that in the face of divine promises, there was still a lingering doubt. Last week we left off with the doubts of the Israelite slaves in verse 9. Moses had just shared with them what God had told him to share, the promises of rescue and redemption and relocation. And yet when they heard those promises, they wouldn't listen. They'd been burned, or at least they felt like they had been burned the last time they believed those promises. Had they been burned? Of course they hadn't really been burned. To be burned would be to say that God let them down. But God did let them wait. And there was a purpose in the waiting. There was a reason for them to wait. There was something that God wanted them to learn and to see in the waiting. And they didn't like that. That didn't coincide with their plans. They had their expectations and God's plans, and they didn't coincide with one another. And so they felt like they had been burned, and so they said, we're not going to listen to this anymore. We're no longer willing to listen to these promises. And once again, God could have punished them for their doubt. He could have let them spend a few more centuries as slaves in Egypt. But as we've been reminding ourselves over and over again the last few weeks, Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, that God is merciful and gracious. We sang about that grace this morning, didn't we? His grace is enough. He's merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. So instead of punishing the Israelite slaves, God, in mercy and grace, kept moving forward with the game plan. That's point number one, the game plan. Look, if you would, at Exodus. We're in chapter 6, verses 10 through 13. This is where we left off last week. So the Lord said to Moses, "Go in, tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But Moses said to the Lord, behold, the people of Israel have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me? For I am of uncircumcised lips. But the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them a charge about the people of Israel and about Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. So in verses 10 and 11, God is like, okay, Moses, here we go again. Round number two, go and tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go. I want to deeply apologize to you for what I am about to do to you. Okay? You are going to have a tune stuck in your head for days, all right? And I apologize for that, but you know what? I've had to have the tune stuck in my head for the last week, so now it's your turn to have this. You remember the song? Maybe you learned it in camp. You learned it in junior church. It went like this. Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, baby, let my people go. Huh. Yeah, 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 I say, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, baby, let my people go. Huh. Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, the burning bush told me just the other day that I should come over here and say, got to get my people out of Pharaoh's hand and lead them on over to the promised land. Okay, sing it with me. Ready? Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, baby, let my people go. Huh. Yeah, 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 yeah. I say, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, baby, let my people go. Yeah, 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 yeah. One more time, I say, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, baby, let my people go. Yeah, 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 yeah. I say, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, baby, let my people go. Yeah, 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 yeah. All right, you should have that song firmly implanted in your brain now. Don't worry, it will eventually wear off. It might take about a week or so, but you've got that. Now listen, I don't know, I'm not sure that the game plan was for Moses to sing to Pharaoh, but as we see in verses 10 and 11, it was God's plan for Moses to go and tell Pharaoh, once again, to let the Israelite slaves go. And then in verse 12, we find the excuse of Moses. The excuse of Moses. Haven't we done this before? Did I bring the wrong? I think I brought the notes from a few weeks ago up here with me. Because we've already seen the excuses of Moses, haven't we? Remember back chapter 4, verse 10. He told God, I'm not eloquent. He said, I'm slow of speech and tongue. Moses basically saying, I'm not a good public communicator. He may very well have been referring to a speech impediment, but he gave that excuse once. And now here we find second verse, same as the first. We've been here before, and Moses is once again searching for excuses, and so he digs down and he finds an old excuse, and he puts a new slant on it. Before we get to that, though, notice what he says first. He says, Lord, the Israelites won't listen to me. Think about that. The Israelites, who stand to gain the most from this, they won't listen to me. How in the world are we ever going to expect Pharaoh to listen to me? Does that sound fair? Does that sound like a logical conclusion to draw? I mean, the Israelites aren't listening to me. Why would Pharaoh ever open his ears? Why would he ever listen to what I have to say? It's kind of almost a logical sounding argument. And Pharaoh, but Moses, I think he knows that it's not quite enough, and so he steps out further and he reworks that old excuse, tries to improve on it, and says, I am of uncircumcised lips. Here we go again. Not a good communicator. Maybe there's a speech impediment, but here he adds the word uncircumcised. In this first point this morning, as we talk about the game plan, we're going to focus on three parts of the body. All right? And we're going to start with Moses' uncircumcised lips. Moses' uncircumcised lips. He says to God, I am of uncircumcised lips. What's he talking about here? Okay? Now, again, go back to chapter 4, verse 10, where he said, I'm not eloquent, I'm slow of speech and tongue, and there could be a part of that he's referencing that. But this word uncircumcised, It leads us to believe there's something else that's going on. And it also reminds us of another couple of verses from chapter 4. Chapter 4, verses 24 through 26. You remember those verses? We looked at those a few weeks ago when Moses was on his way from Midian going back to Egypt, and they came to a lodging place, and there's just this kind of an unusual story. We don't seem to have all of the details, but we know that Moses was dying. He was sick, and it looked like he was about to die. And then something happened. His wife, Zipporah, took a flint knife and circumcised their son. And because of that, Moses lived. Now, that tells us that there was some sort of sin issue for Moses. He was either being unfaithful to God when it came to circumcision. He was maybe being stubborn about this, not wanting to do this. We don't really know. The text doesn't tell us why Moses hadn't circumcised his son and why he seemed to be refusing to do so, but Zipporah did, and Moses lived. But that circumcision, that whole issue of that circumcision was a reminder of Moses' hardness of heart. It was a reminder of his own sin. And so he relates that back now to the sin of his lips. Pastor Aaron, just a few minutes ago, he mentioned what Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 6. When, if you remember the opening verse of that passage, Moses has this vision of God in his throne room, and you know, to summarize it in one word, it would be awesome. Okay, that's what God, or that's what how God appeared to Moses. It was just awesome to see God in all of His glory, in all of His holiness, in all of His majesty. And what conclusion did Isaiah draw? When you see perfect, pure holiness, the first thing you think of is, how sinful am I? I don't measure up to that. And that's what Isaiah did. He said, I am a man of unclean lips. That's what Isaiah said. And I think Moses is doing this. Of course, Isaiah would be many years later, but I think Moses was the first one to sort of do this, to say, there's this past sin issue in my life that makes me unqualified or unfit to do what you're asking me to do. God says to Moses, it's time to go back in and face Pharaoh. Round 2. Round 1 didn't go so well, but at least you had the Israelites backing you up at that point. Now the Israelites aren't listening to you, and I still want you to go in and I want you to talk to Pharaoh again. And he's like, they're not listening to me. Why would Pharaoh listen to me? God, I got to come up with some excuse. I'm a man, I'm of uncircumcised lips, he says. And I think beyond just referencing his inadequacies as a public speaker, I think he's also referencing his past sin and saying, my past sin would prohibit me from doing what you are calling me to do. Can I ask you, friends, do you think the sin of your past is ever a good excuse for telling God no when he calls you to serve him? Let's understand one thing. There are sins that might disqualify someone from doing certain things within the church and in church leadership. But when God is calling someone to service, there's not an excuse. There's not any excuse that we can ever make to get out of following God's call in our lives. When God's calling us to serve him, when God's calling us to move and to act, we have to do it. Or we're in disobedience to God. It's that simple. There is no middle ground. There's no excuse we can come up with where God's going to say, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, you're right, Moses. You are of uncircumcised lips. I guess I better find someone else. That was never going to happen. Moses was either going to go to Pharaoh or he was going to be disobedient. And so he's grasping for these excuses because he doesn't want to go, because he is sure that Pharaoh is not going to listen to him. But what Moses failed to understand is that Pharaoh would not listen to him. He was right in his estimation, by the way. The Israelites aren't listening to me. Why would Pharaoh listen to me? You're absolutely right, Moses. They're not going to listen to you. Or Pharaoh is not going to listen to you. In fact, Pharaoh cannot listen to you. You know why? Because God is going to harden his heart. God's already told Moses that. God has already told him, I am going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And so he cannot listen to you. Listen, friends, it was not, for Moses, it was not his to question God's plan. It was simply his to obey. And so in verse 13, Yahweh speaks again to Moses and Aaron and gives them a charge about the Israelite slaves and Pharaoh, the Egyptian king. And this is the plan, this is the game plan, to bring the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. In order to learn more about that plan, let's skip ahead and look at chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. And the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. In these verses, we find the execution of the plan. Okay, we're talking about the game plan. First, we saw the excuse of Moses. Now we see the execution of the plan. Verses 1 and 2 are fascinating because in those verses, we find that Yahweh tells Moses, I have made you like God to Pharaoh. Just as God has prophets to communicate his word, so too would Moses have his brother Aaron, who would seem like, to Pharaoh, would seem like his prophet. And so Moses told Aaron, and Aaron spoke to Pharaoh, and that's what Pharaoh would look to Moses, and he would seem like God. Let me be very clear. God is not saying that Moses is God, obviously. He's not saying that Moses is a God. What is he saying? He says, to Pharaoh you will seem like God. Okay? That's the perception. Now, what's fascinating about that is, I want to take you back a couple of weeks. Remember who Pharaoh believed himself to be. Remember, in Egypt, the people of Egypt were polytheists. That just means they believed there were many gods. But they also believed that Pharaoh was the manifestation of all of those gods. In other words, the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was the sovereign God, and Pharaoh believed himself to be that. And so here it's interesting. I don't know, I've been going back and forth as I've studied this. I don't know if this is funny, comical, or if it's just ironic. I'm not sure exactly what it is, how to describe this, but here you've got this guy who believes himself to be God, and God saying to Moses, I'm going to make you seem like God to Pharaoh. In other words, what God is saying is, I am going to change his perception so that Pharaoh's perception about Moses would be that he is like God. But God did more than just change Pharaoh's perception about Moses, didn't he? Verse 3, he also hardened Pharaoh's heart. That brings us to the second part of the body. Remember, so we're going to look at three parts of the body. First was Moses' uncircumcised lips. Now it's Pharaoh's hardened heart. Pharaoh's hardened heart. You might wonder why God would make Moses seem like God to Pharaoh and then go on to harden his heart. Remember I told you a few weeks ago that in Exodus, it's about 50-50. The times where the text tells us that God hardened Pharaoh's heart and the times where it tells us that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Okay? And what that tells us is this, is that Pharaoh, he was filled with pride and arrogance and stubbornness, and he was not going to move from that. His heart was hard. His will needed to be broken, and so God hardened Pharaoh's heart, verse 3. so that he would not, in fact, could not listen to Moses and Aaron. That's what it says there in verse 4. And so when Moses said, hey, the people of Israel won't listen to me, how will we expect Pharaoh to listen to me? God's like, what's your point, Moses? I already told you I'm going to harden his heart. Of course he's not going to listen to you. It's not yours to question my plan. It's yours to obey my plan. And so God says, and still in verse 4, God tells Moses that he is going to lay his hand on Egypt and bring the host of his people out of Egypt by great acts of judgment. This brings us to the third part of the body we're talking about, and that is God's mighty hand. God's mighty hand. The great acts of judgment are the 10 plagues that, Lord willing, we will cover in the next series from Exodus that I'm tentatively calling the lesson and tentatively planning for early 2023. And we'll get back to Exodus next year, Lord willing. But these great acts of judgments, these 10 plagues, would be the demonstration of God stretching out his mighty hand, verse 5. In verse 6, we find that Moses and Aaron did so. That means they executed the plan. That means they went into Pharaoh, knowing that he wasn't going to listen, knowing that the Israelites weren't standing beside them any longer, because they're filled with doubt. They're like, no more, we're not going to do this anymore. Knowing that Moses knowing that he is inadequate, that he's ordinary, that he has past sin issues, knowing all of those things, and ultimately trusting God, they executed the plan. They went in and confronted Pharaoh for the second time and said, you need to let these people go. And I want you to understand, that was not easy. That was really, really hard. And I want you to understand that doing that was way, way outside of their comfort zones. But they did what God was calling them to do. God ever call us to do things that are outside of our comfort zones? Anyone ever had to do that? Anyone ever have to do that this last week? This is life, isn't it? We have to do things that we're not always comfortable doing, but that's obedience to the will of God. Sometimes we have to do things that are really, really hard. But it's not ours. It is not ours to question God. It is ours to obey and to do what it is that he's calling us to do. In verse 7, we find one more potential excuse. Now, as far as we know, Moses never used this excuse. He never used his age as an excuse, but he could have. He pointed to his inabilities. He raised the issue of past sin. Thankfully, as far as we know, he never used his advanced age as an excuse. And some of you are saying, wait a minute, Pastor Mike, where do you get off calling 80 advanced age, right? You know, have you ever noticed the older you get, the older old is? You know, it doesn't seem that old anymore. Not trying to give anybody, if you're getting close to that 80 mark, not trying to give you a hard time, but I do want to point out that it was Moses who wrote the 90th Psalm. And in the 90th Psalm, listen to what he wrote in Psalm 90, verse 9. He said that the years of life are 70, or by reason of strength, 80. In other words, Moses at this point is kind of at the far reaches of what he thought the lifespan ought to be. Now, he would go on to live for another 40 years by God's grace, but he did not know that he would live for another 40 years at that point. In Moses' estimation, his life was pretty well spent. And he could have very easily said, look, Lord, I'm too old. I'm too old to do this. Thankfully, he didn't use that excuse, but we'll come back to that at the end. Thankfully, Moses did what God called him to do. This reminds me of someone else. Moses just seemed like God to Pharaoh, but Jesus is God. And he is the eternal Son of the living God who one day took on human flesh so that he is now both holy God and wholly human. He came to do what the Father had sent him to do. And it was really, really hard. It was way, way outside of his comfort zone. You see, Jesus told us what the Father sent him to do, and that was to seek and to save that which was lost. Luke chapter 19, verse 10, he tells us that. By the way, those who are lost, that's describing us. It's describing you, it's describing me. That's what Jesus came to do. It wasn't easy, but he came to accomplish the Father's will. The Bible states that we're all born in sin, that we are lost in sin, and that our sin separates us from God. And what's worse, there's not one thing that any of us can ever do about it. We can never save ourselves. No matter how many good works you do, no matter how good a person you try to be, no matter how much religious effort you put forth, there is not one thing that you can ever do to save yourself. Thankfully, Jesus was sent to seek and to save that which was lost, and he did it. He executed that plan by doing what the Father had called him to do. Because he is perfect as the Son of God, he is fully God, holy God. That means he's perfect in every way. There is no sin in him. That means his life was perfect, and therefore his life was the perfect sacrifice, the perfect payment for sin. Because he is also wholly human, he was able to offer that perfection, that perfect life as payment for our sin when he bled and died on the cross. Because he's perfect, death couldn't hold him. Death is the consequence of sin. He had no sin, so death couldn't keep hold of him, and he rose again victorious. His resurrection proves that his payment for our sin was full and complete and perfect. It proves that he lives today and that he is able and willing to save all who come to him in faith. You can't save yourself, but Jesus can save you. But you have to put your faith and trust in him. It's the only way. So I want to ask you, friends, do you believe in Jesus? If so, if today is like the first, maybe today is like the first time you've ever heard this. Maybe you've heard this 1,000 times. But today is the day. You're like, yep, this is it. I believe this. This is where my faith lies. This is where I'm placing my trust. If that describes you right now, would you just tell him that you believe? You just pray to him and say, Lord Jesus, I trust you right now, believing you're the only one that can save me. I trust you to forgive my sin, to save me from that sin. You are my Savior. You are my Lord. Friend, if today is the day that you put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, would you come and speak to me after the service this morning? If you're watching the live stream, would you leave a comment right now so that we can know and contact you? Moving on, let's consider some verses that have a lot of scholars kind of scratching their heads, have been for many years. Verses 14 through 25. Back in chapter 6, verses 14 through 25. These are the heads of their fathers' houses, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. These are the clans of Reuben. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul. These are of the sons of a Canaanite woman. These are the clans of Simeon. These are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations: Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, the years of the life of Levi being 137 years. The sons of Gershon, Libni and Shimei, by their clans. The sons of Kohath, Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel, the years of the life of Kohath being 133 years. The sons of Merari, Mali and Mushi, these are the clans of the Levites according to their generations. Amram took as his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses, the years of the life of Amram being 137 years. The sons of Izhar, Korah, Nepheg, Zikri, and the sons of Uzziel, Mishael, Elzaphan, and Sithri. Aaron took as his wife Elisheba, the daughter of Amminadab, and the sister of Nashon, and she bore him Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Sons of Korah, Asir, Elkanah, and Abiasaph. These are the clans of the Korahites. Eleazar, Aaron's son, took as his wife one of the daughters of Putiel, and she bore him Phinehas. And these are the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites by their clans. Here we find the genealogical record. That's point number 2, the genealogical record. Aren't you glad the Bible has genealogies? All God's people said, maybe not. Genealogies are important in the Bible. How many of you, just be honest now, time for confession, how many of you reading through the Bible have gotten to the genealogies and just skipped past them? Just raise your hand. Shame, shame, shame. Okay, I want to urge you not to do that. I want to urge you to read the genealogies because genealogies actually are important. As we read through the genealogies and we see the names and the history present in those genealogies, they testify to the historicity of the Bible. In fact, did you know there are some cultures in the world who, as they have learned the Bible and studied the Bible, have failed to see the importance of God's Word until they got to the genealogies. And it's when they got to the genealogies, because that history is so important to them, and they can trace history, and they know that their history is real because they know who begat whoever, and who begat whoever, and who begat whoever. And they read the genealogies in the Bible, and now they know, this is history. This is real. So genealogies are very important. I urge you to read through the genealogies. But I mentioned a moment ago that biblical scholars have long scratched their heads over this particular genealogy. And the reason for that is simply that this genealogy is two things. It is A, abbreviated, and B, it seems misplaced. Okay? It is abbreviated. We'll talk about that. And it seems misplaced. It's actually not, but it seems almost like it's misplaced. All right, so let's consider these things. Why does it start with the sons of Jacob? How many sons does Jacob have? Did I hear the answer? How many sons does Jacob have? 12 sons. 12 sons. Okay, and how many sons are mentioned in this genealogy? 3. You've got Reuben, the firstborn, Simeon, the secondborn, and Levi, the third son. Okay? They don't even mention Judah, who was the fourth born of Leah, who was born next. Judah's not even mentioned, let alone all the other sons. And so this genealogy is clearly abbreviated. In fact, did you notice that with Reuben and Simeon, they each get one verse? And it's just, here's Reuben's sons, here's Simeon's sons. Don't know how long each of those guys lived. Don't know anything. And then we get to Levi. Levi gets, I think it's 10 verses that are dedicated to him. We know how long he lived. We know how long Kohath lived. And we know how long Moses and Aaron's father lived. And so there's so much more information given about the clans of Levi. Okay, so we know that there's an abbreviation to this genealogy. The other thing we have to address is that here we are in the midst of the story of God's plan being executed, where God gives the game plan, and Moses and Aaron need to go execute this game plan, and then it's like it's almost interrupted by this story of this genealogy. And it seems almost like it's out of place. So why? Why is all of this happening? Why is this genealogy here in the first place? To answer that, it helps to understand a few things. Who wrote the book of Exodus? Moses. Okay? To whom was the book of Exodus originally written? The Israelites, and specifically the Israelites who were coming out of the 40 years of wandering. So this was written probably toward the end of Moses' life, and it was written toward those Israelites who may have only had vague memories of going through the Red Sea and drinking water from the rock. And they needed this history so that they could identify more with their heritage and understand who Moses and Aaron were. And so those are important things for us to understand. Understanding these things helps us understand why this genealogy is here in this portion of the text and why it is composed the way that it is. For the Israelites reading this historical account of Exodus, this genealogy established that Aaron and Moses were Israelites. Okay? That's what this genealogy does. There's two things I believe this genealogy does. The first is that it established Aaron and Moses as Israelites. In verses 14 through 16, we clearly see that they are descendants of the patriarchs and specifically of Levi. And because the purpose of this genealogy was to establish their place in Israel, there was really no need to continue on with Judah. There was the purpose of this genealogy had fulfilled this genealogy had fulfilled its purpose by establishing that Moses and Aaron were Israelites. Now, there's a few other things that we see in here that sort of kind of tell the story of Israel. And so, yes, it tells the readers of Exodus that Moses and Aaron were ethnically Israelites, but it also shows them that they were a part of the culture, of the makeup of this nation of people. And so let's take a look at a few of these things. From verses 16 through 20, we find the ancestral line that led to Aaron and Moses, not only proving their heritage among all the other Israelites, but specifically showing them to be the sons of Levi, that they were in fact Levites. And so if we look at the sons of Levi, the three sons that are listed there in Levi, and if you were to go to Numbers chapter 3, you would be very familiar with these three names, the names of these three sons. Okay, so it would start with the descendants of Gershon, who had in Numbers chapter 3, verses 25 and 26 tells us that the sons of Gershon were in charge of the coverings of the tabernacle. You know, the tabernacle was a tent, and it was surrounded by a series of screens that formed the outer courts. And all of the fabric, all of the weavings and tapestries, the Gershonites had charge of that. Whenever the tabernacle had to be moved, they would be in charge of those things. And then when we come to Numbers chapter 3, verse 30, we find that it's the descendants of Kohath who had charge of the furnishings in the tabernacle, the altar, the bronze sea, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, the candelabra, the Ark of the Covenant. All of that was the charge of the Kohathites. They would be the ones who would move those things. And then in Numbers chapter 3, verses 36 and 37, it's the descendants of Merari who were in charge of the framework, all of the poles and the bases and everything that made up the framework. They were in charge of moving those things. Not only that, it would be these three family clans who, every time the tabernacle would get set up, they set up their encampments around the perimeter of the tabernacle. And so all of the Israelites knew this. Toward the end of the wilderness wandering, everybody knew who the Gershonites, the Kohathites, and the sons of Merari were. They understood that. They knew who these people were, and they could totally identify this is part of our heritage. In verses 21 and 24, they read about Korah. Korah was Aaron and Moses' first cousin, the son of Izhar. And if you're familiar with Korah, certainly by the tail end of the 40 years in the wilderness, the Israelites knew who Korah was. It was an infamous event in Numbers chapter 16. This first cousin of Moses and Aaron led a rebellion because he was jealous of Aaron. It's like, how come Aaron gets to be the priest? And he leads this rebellion, the rebellion of Korah, and everybody knew about that. That's part of their heritage. Verses 23 through 25, we find the connection of Aaron and his sons and to one of his grandsons who served as priests during the years of the wilderness wandering. You may be familiar with Nadab and Abihu, who were rather infamous for their brazen sin of burning incense before the Lord in the pattern of the pagan nations. And as a result of that sin, it cost them their lives. We read about that in Leviticus 10, verses 1 and 2. On the other hand, Eleazar's son and Aaron's grandson Phinehas was a hero in Israel for his zeal for the Lord. The story is told in Numbers 25 of a rather dark period in Israel's history where the Moabites sent women down into the camp of the Israelites to seduce the men of Israel, and it was all in order to turn the hearts of the people away from God, away from Yahweh. And so as this was happening, there was a plague as a result of this, and in punishment of this. And the story is told, it's a rather interesting story of how we had this one man whose name is Zimri. He brings a Midianite woman named Cosbi into the tabernacle of all places in order to engage with her in physical intimacy, in order to partake in a pagan form of worship. If you were here Wednesday night, we talked about that a little bit. But that's what's about to happen here. And it's Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, who sees this, and his zeal for the Lord causes him to grab a spear and go in and run them both through, and thus bring an end to the plague on Israel. And God commended Phinehas for this. And Phinehas was a national hero to the Israelites. Every one of the people who read the book of Exodus for the very first time knew exactly who he was and what he had done. And now they can see all of the connections to their own history. And within all of this history, here is this genealogy that includes the names of Aaron and Moses, which establishes the fact that these men were Israelites and were thus qualified and fit to lead Israel out of Egypt. But this genealogy also established that Aaron and Moses were ordinary. It established that they were ordinary. Remember in chapter 7, verse 1, God reveals, and Moses is about to reveal to the Israelites, that God's plan was to make him seem like God to Pharaoh and to make Aaron seem like a prophet. But it was important to Moses that the people know he was just an ordinary guy. He was just the son of a son of a son of a son, going all the way back to Levi and back to Jacob. And that's why verses 26 through 30 are here. Look at those verses as we prepare to conclude. Verses 26 through 30, these are the Aaron and Moses, to whom the Lord said, "Bring out the people of Israel from the land of Egypt by their hosts." It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the people of Israel from Egypt, this Moses and this Aaron. On the day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, the Lord said to Moses, "I am the Lord. Tell the king of Egypt all that I say to you." But Moses said to the Lord, "Behold, I am of uncircumcised lips. How will Pharaoh listen to me?" In these verses, we see the glory directed. That's the last point. The glory directed. That is, Moses deflects any glory away from himself and his brother Aaron. He makes it clear that they were just these ordinary guys whom God used to accomplish extraordinary things. Not that they were extraordinary, just that God is extraordinary. It's that God is infinite, that God can do extraordinary things using ordinary people who are obedient to his call. Moses even reminds the people, again in verse 30, he wasn't a gifted speaker. He reminds them of his past sin issues. He's a man of uncircumcised lips. He's saying to them, listen, guys, it's not about me. None of this was me. It was all God. To God be the glory. What now? Allow me to wrap up this message and this series by leaving you with 2 points of application that are really just two facets of the same thing. First, when God directs you to serve him, don't look for excuses not to serve. Don't look for excuses not to serve. Moses pointed to his inabilities. He said, I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech and tongue. Friends, do not lean on your inabilities to ignore God's call to service. I've heard Christians say before, look, that's not my area of giftedness. I'm not gifted in that area. Well, guess what? We don't always have to be gifted in a certain area to serve the Lord if the Lord is calling us to serve him in that area. I'll give you a couple examples. I do not believe that my area of spiritual giftedness is giving. I don't have that. But you know what? That does not absolve me from my obligation to tithe. Right? You agree? Go like this. Yes, Pastor Mike, you need to give. So do I. We need to give. I may not have the gift of giving, but I still have to tithe. I do not view myself as gifted in evangelism. But you know what? My Lord said to me, go and make disciples of all nations. He said to me, you will be a witness for me. I have to be a witness. I may not be gifted in evangelism, but I still have to obey that call. So don't use that as an excuse. Don't look at your inabilities as an excuse. Don't look at your past sin. Moses pointed to that. He said, I'm of uncircumcised lips. I believe he was pointing to past sin in his life and saying, I can't serve you, Lord. Do you believe that God only uses perfect people? If you believe that, you need to rethink that, because there's no such thing as a perfect person except for Jesus Christ and him alone. Everyone in this room right now is fallen and flawed, but if your faith is in Jesus, guess what? You are forgiven. And God can and will use you, but you need to be obedient to his call. Moses could have pointed to his advanced age. Do you think you're too old? Do you think you're too young to serve the Lord when the Lord calls you to serve him? If so, then you're believing the lies of hell. Moses could have pointed to the fact that he was just an ordinary guy. Do you believe that God can only use extraordinary people? I hope that you don't believe that, because I'm looking at right now, don't take this the wrong way, but I'm looking at a room right now of ordinary people, right? I don't see any extraordinary people, except for my wife. See how I saved that one? I can eat today. Now, we're all just ordinary people. There's no one that's extraordinary here, except for God. And God takes ordinary people and he accomplishes extraordinary things through ordinary people when ordinary people are obedient to his call. Don't look for excuses. Be willing to get out of your comfort zone. Be willing to do hard things. Answer his call to serve. Second, when you do serve the Lord, be sure that he gets all the glory. Be sure he gets all the glory. One of the reasons Moses included the genealogy in chapter 6 was, I believe, to show that he was nothing special. And that all the special things that unfolded were because of God's mighty hand. In fact, Moses was even careful to remind everyone again, verse 30, of his inability, his fallibility, and even his doubts. If it had been up to Moses, the Exodus would have never happened. God and God alone deserved the glory. When you serve and someone praises you, maybe tells you did a good job, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I always appreciate that when someone does that. But usually, typically, I try to make my response, thank you, praise the Lord. Let God be praised in those times. When you receive a compliment for your service, make sure that the glory goes to him. To him be the glory, both now and forevermore. God's people said.